We were returning to our hometown for the first time in several years. As I looked out the car window, everything felt shrouded in a strange sense of déjà vu. The familiar roads, small houses with white fences and trees lining the streets seemed so familiar, yet somehow distant. Home. I wasn't sure if that word still described how I felt. Tom was driving quietly, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had always been this way, calm, composed. His eyes, focused on the road, occasionally glanced at mine, and I saw the same concern and care in them as always. He was there, always supporting me, but I knew that our relationship had changed over the years. We were no longer that passionate couple we once were. Everything had become quieter, more routine, and at times, dull. I knew that Tom was content with it, but inside me something was stirring. We turned onto the street where Laura and Mark lived, and I felt my heart quicken. My daughter, I missed her so much, her bright laughter, how she used to share all her thoughts with me. But recently, something had changed. Laura had become more reserved, called less frequently, spoke in short phrases, as if hiding something inside. When we stopped in front of her house, Laura came out onto the porch. The wind stirred her blonde hair, and a smile flickered across her face, but I immediately noticed something new in her eyes, tiredness. She hugged me, but it was brief, as if she was in a hurry to move on to something else. Tom approached Mark, who stood at the door, and they shook hands. Unlike Laura, Mark looked calm and confident. His dark eyes met mine, and I felt like there was something more in them than just a simple greeting. "How was the trip?" Laura asked as we stepped inside. "It was fine," I replied, glancing around. The house was cozy, but there was something strange, cold, as if the air was heavy. "How are you? Everything okay?" Laura nodded, but her smile seemed forced. We sat down at the table, and I noticed that Mark hardly looked at Laura. Instead, his attention was focused on me. Unconsciously, I felt uncomfortable, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Tom started a conversation about how we had missed this place, how happy he was to be back. He had always been good at smoothing over awkward moments, and I was grateful to him for that. But that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And that something had to do with Laura and Mark. After dinner, we all went to our rooms, but I couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts of Laura wouldn't leave my mind. I remembered her joyful face when she first married Mark, how they always seemed like such a harmonious couple. And now I couldn't help but notice the chasm that had formed between them. Mark was becoming more distant, and there was something about that distance that I couldn't quite understand. Perhaps it was just work, stress, or maybe something more. I fell asleep with a heavy heart, feeling that changes were coming. The next day, I decided to talk to Laura. We went for a walk along the quiet street by the river near their house. The water seemed calm, almost like a mirror, reflecting the blue sky and occasional clouds. The rustle of the leaves created a peaceful atmosphere, but I could feel that Laura was troubled. Her face was tense, although she tried to smile. "Mom, I feel like I need to talk to you," she said suddenly, as if breaking free from her thoughts. "Of course," I squeezed her hand. "What's wrong?" Laura sighed, her gaze distant. "Mark, we're not like we used to be. I don't know how to describe it. He's become cold. Sometimes it feels like he's not even there, even when he's sitting right in front of me." I looked at my daughter with concern. Laura had always been honest with me, and I knew that if she was bringing up problems, it meant things were serious. "Have you talked to him about it?" I asked carefully, trying to gauge how deep the rift went. Laura shook her head. "He doesn't listen, and even when he does, it looks like he doesn't care. I don't know what happened to us. It started gradually, but now it feels like we're two completely different people." My heart tightened. I wanted to help, but what could I do? "Maybe he's just stressed," I suggested. "Is work difficult for him?" "I don't think so." Laura looked exhausted. "I'm afraid it's not about work. Sometimes I feel like he's just not interested in being around me anymore." We fell silent. The sound of the river seemed too loud against the backdrop of our quiet. Later that evening, when we all gathered for dinner, I noticed that Mark kept glancing at me. His looks were strange, almost probing. It was absurd. How could he look at me like that when his wife sat beside him? I felt uncomfortable and tried not to meet his gaze, but the tension between us was becoming increasingly apparent. Tom also noticed that Laura seemed worried. He tried to start a conversation about the baby, hoping to cheer her up. "Laura, how are you feeling?" he asked gently, touching her shoulder. "You're going to be a mom soon," she answered briefly, reservedly. "I'm fine, Dad. A little nervous, but nothing special." But I could see that it wasn't true. Something much bigger was bothering her, and now I knew it had to do with Mark. When Laura and Tom left for the hospital, the house was engulfed in a silence so deep it felt like it was pressing down on me. I sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of tea, trying to focus on the familiar sounds of the house. But it didn't help. My mind was filled with thoughts about Laura and Mark. Their relationship, once strong, now seemed fragile, like glass. And though I tried to convince myself it wasn't my place to interfere, my heart wouldn't let go. Mark should have gone with them. His presence would have been a support for Laura, but he declined, citing important work, and something in his excuse struck me as odd. Maybe it was just a premonition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he simply wanted to stay behind. As evening fell, I felt a strange unease. The distant sound of the evening wind echoed outside, and the dim autumn sun cast long shadows through the window. I was preparing for a night spent in solitude when suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Mark. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying a slight hesitation. "Are you alone?" "Yes, come in," I replied, surprised by his appearance. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and walked into the kitchen. I noticed how he kept his eyes fixed on me. His gaze was oddly focused, and the tension in the air made my heart race. "I thought you might be bored alone," he said, sitting down across from me. We sat in silence, staring at each other. I couldn't understand what was happening, but something about his behavior unsettled me. "Margaret, I've wanted to talk to you for a long time," he finally said. His voice was quiet but firm. "About what?" I asked, feeling a tightness inside. Mark stood up, walked over to me, and suddenly pulled me into a tight embrace. His arms were strong, and I felt myself losing control. My body, which should have resisted, was melting in his arms. I knew this was wrong. I knew I should stop him, but I couldn't. "I like you, Margaret. I have for a long time. I can't hide it anymore," he whispered, looking directly into my eyes. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong, and my heart betrayed me. In that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to resist, I was being drawn to him. The pull was too strong. Our lips met. It was a kiss we had both suppressed for too long. Suppressed to keep the boundaries that now shattered into pieces. Every fiber of me screamed that this was wrong, but with each of his touches, with every moment in his arms, my inner barriers crumbled. After that kiss, I could hardly breathe. The moment Mark left, the house fell into a suffocating silence, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me, preventing me from thinking clearly. A wave of guilt washed over me. I had betrayed Laura, my daughter, who was now so vulnerable, needing support and care. I had betrayed Tom, the man who had always been by my side, even when our relationship had cooled. But most of all, I had betrayed myself. That night, I barely slept. The thoughts of what had happened spun in my head, and with every passing minute, the guilt only grew stronger. But the next morning, when Mark knocked on the door again, I felt something that contradicted all those pangs of conscience. I was drawn to him. What should have been a fleeting moment of weakness had become something far more powerful than I could have imagined. When he entered, his gaze was filled with determination. "We can't ignore this anymore," he said the moment the door closed behind him. "I know you feel the same way I do." I tried to protest, but the words caught somewhere deep inside me. Mark stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, almost suffocating. He spoke of how long he had felt this pull, how Laura had distanced herself from him, how her coldness had slowly destroyed their relationship. He said he had found in me what he had been missing all these years. I tried to convince myself that this was wrong, that it was all a mistake. But when his arms wrapped around me again and his lips met mine, all my objections melted away. I couldn't resist anymore. Every kiss, every touch unleashed a storm of emotions inside me that I could no longer ignore. We spent the next few days in complete isolation, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. We hardly left the room, as if trying to hide from the reality where our actions could destroy everything. Mark showed no signs of doubt. His passion was strong and unwavering. And despite all my inner turmoil, I couldn't pull away from him. In his arms, I felt alive, desired, despite all the wrongness of what was happening around us. In those moments, I tried to justify it to myself. Laura and Tom were at the hospital, safe from harm, while Mark and I were here, locked away in our own world. We knew we had little time, and that only heightened the intensity between us. Every moment felt like a forbidden pleasure that couldn't be restrained. But with each passing day, the tension inside me grew. I knew this would end sooner or later. Laura would return, Tom would be by my side again, and our lives would have to go on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't turn back anymore. Something had changed forever, and I didn't know how to deal with it. When Tom and Laura returned from the hospital, the house resumed its usual rhythm. Laura looked more relaxed after all the checkups, and a slight smile flickered on her face. I felt a small sense of relief seeing her like that. The worries about the baby's health seemed to have subsided, and she was ready to embrace her pregnancy again. Tom was by her side, as caring and attentive as ever. He immediately got back into the routine, as if nothing had changed during the time they were away. But for me, everything had changed. I couldn't act the way I used to. The memories of those few days with Mark haunted me. I wanted to go back to when things were normal, when I could look into Laura's eyes without feeling this gnawing guilt. But now, an invisible yet palpable line lay between Mark and me, a line we had both crossed. I tried to avoid him. Every time he entered the room, I felt something tighten inside me. I avoided his gaze, tried not to be alone with him, but his presence drew me in like a magnet. There was an ongoing battle inside me. My mind told me it had to stop, but my heart refused to agree. Tom, on the other hand, noticed nothing unusual. He was fully absorbed in caring for Laura, trying to support her and rebuild their relationship. There was not the slightest hint of suspicion in his behavior. He was still as attentive to me as ever, and that made my situation even more unbearable. Every caring gesture from him only deepened my sense of guilt. I knew he deserved the truth, but I also feared the consequences. That day, as we all sat at the dinner table, I found myself barely touching my food. I watched Laura, so relaxed and happy, and thought about how fragile the world she believed in truly was. I wanted to scream, to tell her everything, but I couldn't. How could I betray my daughter like this? Mark, however, remained calm. He acted as if nothing had happened, and his confidence infuriated me. In his eyes, I could see that he wanted more, that what had already happened wasn't enough for him. I, on the other hand, didn't know how to navigate this situation without destroying everything around me. No matter how hard I tried to resist, I kept being drawn to him again and again. We both understood that something was bound to happen sooner or later, but as long as Tom and Laura were in the house, I tried to hold on. Inside, everything was boiling. Every glance, every touch felt like it was teetering on the edge. I couldn't be myself. I couldn't breathe freely. It felt like I was living on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move could send everything crashing down. It happened in the evening after Tom and Laura had already gone to bed. I was sitting in the living room, lost in thought, when Mark unexpectedly entered the room. His steps were quiet, but I immediately felt his presence, as if the air around us had suddenly grown heavier. I knew that sooner or later we would find ourselves alone again. Our brief encounters and exchanged glances had only increased the tension between us, and now the moment had come. "We need to talk," he said, walking closer to me. His voice was low and determined, and I knew there was no escaping this conversation. I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. A storm was raging inside me. On one hand, I knew that this needed to stop. On the other, I couldn't deny what was happening between us. My mind kept telling me this was wrong, that I needed to push him away, but my heart resisted. Mark moved closer, his eyes filled with determination. "Margaret, I can't keep hiding this," he began, looking directly into my eyes. "You know how I feel about you, this attraction? It's stronger than me. Every day I understand more and more that I can't ignore my feelings." I felt his words strike straight into my core. I wanted to run, to hide from these feelings, but I couldn't. The pull between us was growing stronger by the minute. I should have stopped him, but instead my hands started to tremble. "Mark, we can't," I tried to say, but my voice failed me. The words sounded too unconvincing, as if I didn't even believe them myself. Mark moved even closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body. His hands gently touched my shoulders, and I felt the tension between us rise. My heart began to race, and I knew I had to resist, but something inside me was already giving in. "I can't take this any longer," he continued. "You draw me in, and I know you feel the same way." He reached out, trying to touch my face, but I suddenly pushed him away. My body reacted instinctively, but it didn't lessen the tension between us. On the contrary, that gesture only made it worse. I looked into his eyes, feeling everything inside me tremble with this conflicting mix of desire and guilt. "Please," I said quietly. "We need to stop." But Mark didn't back down. His eyes were full of passion, and I could see that he wasn't going to give up so easily. "I can't, Margaret. I've tried, but it's impossible. We can't keep pretending that there's nothing between us. You feel it just as much as I do." I knew he was right. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, but I could no longer deny that my attraction to Mark had grown stronger than I had expected. I tried to fight it, but the struggle was nearly lost. My body had betrayed me, and with each moment spent near him, resisting became harder and harder. We were both standing on the edge. I pushed him away, but every time he came closer, the tension between us only intensified. I knew that sooner or later I wouldn't be able to resist any longer. At the very moment when the tension between Mark and me had reached its peak, and it seemed that we could no longer resist this pull, loud cries suddenly filled the air. I froze instantly, and Mark spun toward the door. It was Laura. Her labor had started. All of our emotions and inner conflicts instantly vanished in the face of this new reality. Laura was going into labor. We rushed to her without hesitation. I remember how my heart raced, not from fear or guilt, but from the urgency to act. Tom joined us, and together we hurried to the hospital. Laura was screaming in pain, her face pale and strained, and I tried to remain calm, though inside I was panicking. Once we reached the hospital, time seemed to stretch. The hours passed in a blur as one long moment. Laura's labor went smoothly despite the initial stress, and soon a healthy baby was born. We all sighed with relief. The tense moments were over, and now the only thing that mattered was the baby. I felt proud and happy for Laura, but somewhere deep inside, a sense of unease still lingered. The next few days were spent constantly caring for Laura and the baby. I alternated shifts with Mark and Tom, each of us staying overnight at the hospital, unwilling to leave Laura alone. In those moments when Mark was nearby, I tried to avoid his gaze, knowing that whatever had been between us needed to end. But he kept looking at me with the same expression, the same desire. When Laura and the baby finally came home, life began to slowly return to its normal rhythm. However, the calm was deceptive. One evening, a few days after Laura's return, Mark came back to the house. I knew this conversation was inevitable. He found me in the kitchen, and I felt the tension between us rising once again. "Margaret, I still love you," he said quietly but firmly, as if fearing his words would go unanswered. My heart tightened. I knew I shouldn't listen to him, but I couldn't ignore what I also felt. Everything that had happened between us should have ended the moment Laura gave birth. But Mark wasn't giving up. "This has to be our last night," he continued. "We can't be together, not now that Laura and the baby are here. But I want to spend this night with you, a goodbye night. We deserve at least that." I knew it was wrong, but there was such certainty in his eyes that I couldn't resist. We both understood that this would be the last time. When Laura was already asleep upstairs with the baby, Mark and I spent a passionate evening in the kitchen. We sat in silence for a long time, but eventually the passion overtook us. Every kiss, every touch was a farewell, which only made them more meaningful. "But Laura is sleeping upstairs," I whispered when his hands touched mine. "Are you sure she won't hear us and wake up?" "We'll be careful," Mark assured me, his voice full of determination. "No one will know." And that night, We once again surrendered to the feelings we had tried so hard to suppress. A few days after the farewell night passed in turmoil. I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but inside, guilt and anxiety tormented me. Laura seemed more at ease. Her happiness with the newborn was evident, but I felt that the shadow of our secret was beginning to cast a pall over her joy. One day, as we sat down for lunch, I noticed Laura studying me and Mark closely. She asked questions, but not in her usual manner. There was a cautious glint in her eyes that made my heart race. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the scenery outside the window, but I still felt her penetrating gaze. After lunch, Laura called Tom into another room. I couldn't help but eavesdrop on their conversation. Laura was voicing her suspicions that something was wrong between me and Mark. She couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering her, but her instincts were at work. This both astonished and frightened me. "I just feel like there's something between them," she said, her voice sincere. "They're acting strange. I can't explain it, but it seems to me there's more than just friendship." Tom, sitting at the table, tried to reassure her. "You're just overthinking it," he said with a gentle smile. "Maybe they're just feeling unsure given all the changes in their lives. That's normal." But Laura wasn't convinced. I could hear her voice becoming more insistent. "No, I know they're hiding something. I just can't shake this feeling." I sat in the other room feeling a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to do. How could I explain to Laura that she was right, but at the same time couldn't admit it? I tried to remain calm, but anxiety grew. Every word she spoke felt like a knife, and I couldn't allow myself to show fear. When the conversation ended, I stepped outside to catch my breath. The quietness around me enveloped me, only the wind softly whispering through the trees. I tried to calm myself, but thoughts of Laura wouldn't leave me. I knew our secret could be exposed, and it could destroy everything. Deep down, I realized that ultimately the truth always comes out. My phone rang, and I saw that it was Mark. I hesitated before answering. We needed to talk, but each minute of waiting felt like an eternity. I didn't know how to explain to him what was happening and what I should do next. Time passed, and the tension in our home only grew. I felt a distance forming between Tom and me. He was a caring husband, but in his gaze I began to notice something new. Worry, anxiety, as if he suspected that something was wrong in our family. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen, Tom seemed to be gathering the courage to say something important. I noticed him opening and closing his mouth several times, searching for the right words. Inside, I felt a tight knot forming. I knew the conversation would be difficult. "Margaret," he began, his voice soft yet firm, "I need to talk to you." I nodded, though my heart raced. I understood that this could be a pivotal moment. "I've noticed that something is off," he continued, avoiding my gaze. "We've become distant from each other. I want to understand what's happening." I didn't know how to respond. The words stuck in my throat. I could tell him the truth, but in that moment, fear gripped me. I was scared to shatter whatever was left between us. "It's fine, it's just all these changes." I tried to lie, but it sounded unconvincing. Tom looked at me with a gentle expression, but I saw worry in his eyes. "It's not just changes, Margaret. I feel like you're not fully with me. It's as if we've lost our connection. I still love you, and I want there to be the passion between us that there once was." Those words pierced through me. I hadn't expected such a confession, and it made me think. I remembered how we used to be happy, how we shared dreams and plans. But recently something had shifted, and I couldn't understand when it happened. "I love you too," I said. And it was true, but there was a note of sadness in my voice. "But sometimes I feel like we've become too even, too accustomed to each other." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "That's exactly what worries me. I don't want our marriage to become a gray routine. I want us to be what we used to be. I'm willing to do anything to fix this." I felt something within me begin to sway. His words were both comforting and frightening. I knew I had to decide what I truly wanted. "I'm not sure we can," I admitted. "I don't want to fall into a trap again where there's no room for love." But Tom simply took my hand, and I felt his warmth transferring to me, as if trying to convince me that it was still possible. In that moment, I wanted to remember how we loved each other and how hard it would be to lose all of that. Since Tom had opened up to me, I had become more cautious with every step I took. I knew I had to behave carefully, not to give Laura the slightest hint of suspicion. But deep down, I understood that the more I tried to hide the truth, the harder it would be later on. One evening, as we sat down for lunch, I noticed Laura frequently stepping into another room. She seemed agitated, and I could feel that something was bothering her. I couldn't guess what was on her mind, but soon it became clear. When Mark and I were alone in the hallway, he once again began to speak about his feelings. I tried to push him away, but he persistently continued. "I can't forget that night," he said, his voice filled with passion. "We can't just leave it like this. I still love you." At that moment, Laura returned from the kitchen. She froze in place, her eyes widening in shock. I didn't realize how close she had come, and her presence stunned me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and betrayal. I felt everything inside me twist. I didn't know how to explain the situation. It was as if the world had collapsed, and I found myself at the eye of the storm. Mark looked at me with concern, but I knew he couldn't explain this for me. "Mom, she began, and there was fury in her voice. "You betrayed me." Tears welled up in my eyes. I wanted to say that I hadn't betrayed her, that it was all more complicated than it seemed, but I couldn't find the words. Every accusation from Laura cut like a knife. I understood that she couldn't grasp the complexity of the situation, and I was terrified of her reaction. "Laura, calm down," Tom interjected, trying to restore order. He stepped closer, attempting to soothe her. "Let's talk calmly." But Laura wouldn't listen. Her eyes were full of rage and pain, and I could see her fists clenching. The intensity of all these emotions was too much, and I felt the dark abyss of guilt opening up beneath me. I was responsible for this, and now everything was crumbling. "You promised that everything would be fine," she spat. "You let this happen." "Laura, I didn't want to." I tried to explain, but once again I found myself trapped by my words. Tom, caught in the center of this conflict, looked at us with clear concern. He tried to keep the family from completely falling apart, but he didn't know how to do it. I realized that his support could help, but even he seemed bewildered. In his eyes, I saw confusion, and that only deepened my sense of guilt. Every word, every emotion that poured from Laura's lips was justified. I had betrayed her trust, and now the consequences of that betrayal were crashing down on all of us. I knew I wouldn't be able to explain anything further, and all that was left for me was to endure this storm of emotions that I had created myself. After the tumultuous scene when Laura learned about my feelings for Mark, the atmosphere in the house shifted. I watched as Laura and Mark tried to mend their relationship for the sake of the baby. They decided to start attending family therapy, hoping to restore what had been broken. I felt this was a step in the right direction, but my unease grew. At the first session, Laura looked tense. Her face reflected a multitude of emotions, pain, anger, and at the same time, a desire to restore their family. I understood how hard it was for her to forgive the betrayal, and it weighed on me. Every day I tried to support her, but her reactions were cold and distant. Laura didn't want to open up, didn't want to talk about how she felt. "Mom, I don't need your help," she said one day when I offered to sit with her and talk. There was hurt and exhaustion in her voice. "I don't want you to even take care of the baby. I need time." Those words felt like a knife to the heart. I felt helpless, as if my daughter was building a wall between us, shutting me out from her feelings. I understood she was going through a difficult time, but her rejection of my support only intensified my sense of guilt. I couldn't shake the thought that my connection with Mark was the cause of her suffering. Meanwhile, despite her rejection, my feelings for Mark remained a heavy burden. I tried not to think about what had happened between us, but every time I saw him, my heart betrayed me. He couldn't just disappear from my life. With each passing day, I realized that my feelings weren't fading. They were only growing stronger in the shadows where I tried to hide them. During one therapy session, Mark expressed his desire to work on their relationship, but his words felt filled with regret. Laura, on the other hand, couldn't simply let go of her grievances. I watched their interactions and felt the internal conflict escalate into tension. Each time they argued, I found myself at the center of this conflict, unsure of how to help. Every morning, I woke up hoping that Laura would be able to forgive and start a new chapter in her life. But in reality, it looked different. I understood that the process of healing required time, and that this time wouldn't always be comfortable. I had to find a way to be there for her without imposing myself. But how could I do that when every step seemed to provoke rejection? Laura was trying to cope with the feelings that tormented her, and I couldn't help but think that my role here was to be her support, but she wouldn't allow me to do so. I felt trapped between the desire to support my daughter and my own pangs of conscience. Several months had passed since we all faced the challenges that had shaken our family. Time seemed to begin healing wounds, although some still lingered painfully. Laura and Mark were finding their way to reconciliation. Their therapy sessions were yielding results, and while tension still occasionally arose, I saw them striving to rebuild their relationship. Laura had become more open, sometimes sharing her feelings with me, and I was grateful to listen. She was learning to forgive, which was a crucial step toward healing. I felt that trust was slowly being reestablished between us, though it was still cautious. I tried to support her, knowing that this process was not easy. Mark was also making an effort, and I noticed how he was changing. His attention to Laura became more sincere, and he did everything possible to be a better husband and father. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in him, even though that secret still lay between us, one we both preferred not to discuss. We were all taking steps forward despite the complex circumstances, and that gave me hope. I found comfort in my roles as a mother and grandmother. With each day spent with my granddaughter, I felt my love and care becoming a foundation for our family. I rediscovered the joys of motherhood and grandmotherhood. When I held her in my arms and saw her smiling face, I understood that all my sacrifices were not in vain. The time spent with family filled my life with meaning. I realized that despite all the hardships and pain, my decisions had been right. Yes, they had been painful, but in the end, they led us to become closer. We learned to understand each other, to forgive and to love, despite past mistakes. Now, as we sat together at the table discussing everyday matters, I felt we had become stronger. Every laugh, every warm conversation was a step toward a new reality in which we could be happy together, no matter what we had endured. I knew that new challenges awaited us in the future, but at that moment, I was ready to face them. I believed in my family and in our ability to get through everything together.